Right now, as you watch this, something is working on you. Not a demon with horns, not a shadow in the corner of your room. Something quieter. Something that has already gotten further into your life than you would ever admit. And the terrifying part is this: you would not even recognize it if it introduced itself. In the year 1942, in the middle of a world tearing itself apart with bombs and gunfire, a former atheist turned Oxford scholar sat down and wrote something so unsettling that readers who picked it up for entertainment finished it and could not sleep. His name was C.S. Lewis, and the warning he left behind is not about some faraway spiritual battlefield. It is about your kitchen table, your phone screen, your quiet Tuesday afternoon. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at an ordinary, boring, uneventful day the same way again. Before we go further, you need to understand who this man actually was, because the warning only makes sense once you understand the mind behind it. Lewis was not a preacher looking for attention. He was not someone chasing a following. He was a brilliant, hard-nosed academic at Oxford and later Cambridge. A man who spent his early adulthood mocking the very faith he would later devote his life to defending. He was, by his own account, dragged toward belief-kicking and resisting the entire way, calling himself the most reluctant convert in all of England. This matters because it means his insight into darkness did not come from wide-eyed faith. It came from a mind trained to doubt everything, a mind that had once stood firmly on the other side and knew exactly how that side thought, how it justified itself, how it built its excuses. When a skeptic like that turns around and tells you the enemy is real and closer than you imagine, you should probably lean in and listen. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. Most people, when they imagine evil, imagine something dramatic. A villain. A monster. A moment of obvious temptation with flashing warning signs. Lewis said that picture is not just wrong, it is dangerous, because it is exactly the picture that lets the real thing walk past you unnoticed. He believed the most effective evil never announces itself. It does not arrive wearing a costume. It arrives disguised as something reasonable, something small, something you would defend if anyone questioned you about it. It arrives as a delayed phone call you should have made, a slightly exaggerated story you told to look better in front of friends, a grudge you have decided you are simply too tired to let go of today. None of these feel like anything. That is the entire point. And that is what should be sending a small chill down your spine right now. Because if this is true, then the enemy Lewis warned about is not waiting for you somewhere out there. It has already been quietly present in choices you made this week, without a second thought. To explain this, Lewis once imagined the perspective of the tempter itself, in a work that became one of the most talked about pieces of writing in the 20th century. In it, an experienced, senior demon writes a series of letters to a younger, inexperienced one, coaching him on how to secure the soul of an ordinary man. And what is fascinating, what should genuinely unsettle you, is that the senior demon never once recommends anything shocking. He never tells the junior tempter to push the man towards some obvious dramatic sin. Instead, he advises patience. He advises small distractions. He advises keeping the man comfortable, mildly entertained, slightly too busy to think deeply, slightly too proud to admit fault, slightly too cynical to trust anyone completely. The genius of this fictional correspondence is that it exposes something true about how real corruption spreads in an actual human life. It does not come as an earthquake. It comes as erosion. A little sand washed away today. A little more tomorrow. And nobody notices a beach disappearing while they are standing on it. This is where most people would stop paying attention, because erosion sounds boring compared to earthquakes. Do not stop. This is exactly the part you need to hear, because Lewis was blunt about it. He said the safest route toward ruin is never the sudden dramatic fall. It is the gradual one, the one with no landmarks, no dramatic turning point you could point to later and say, that was the moment everything changed. Just a long, soft, comfortable slope, so gentle underfoot that you genuinely do not feel yourself descending. Think about that for a moment in terms of your own life. Not some fictional villain's life, yours. Think about the version of yourself from 5 years ago and the version sitting here right now. What changed? Was there one single dramatic moment? Or was it 1,000 tiny surrenders so small that none of them, on their own, seemed worth resisting? Let me paint a picture for you, because abstract warnings do not stick, but stories do. Imagine an ordinary person, kind, by most standards, goes to work, loves their family. Nothing about them looks like the beginning of a cautionary tale. One evening they are tired, and instead of calling a friend who has been struggling, they tell themselves they will call tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes never, and the friendship quietly dies, not from betrayal, but from neglect too small to notice. Around the same time, they start checking their phone the moment they wake up, before their feet even touch the floor, scrolling through outrage and comparison before their mind has had a single quiet thought of its own. They start noticing they feel a small flicker of satisfaction when someone they dislike fails at something. They start explaining away small dishonesties at work, because everyone does it. None of these moments feel evil. Each one, taken alone, looks almost forgivable, almost human, almost nothing. But stack them, month after month, and you get a person who has drifted an enormous distance from who they used to be, without ever consciously deciding to become someone worse. That, according to Lewis, is exactly how it is designed to work. Not a war you notice yourself losing, a war you do not even realize you are fighting. Now here comes the twist that most people watching videos like this one never expect, and it is the part that separates a shallow warning from a genuinely dangerous one. Lewis said there are two equal and opposite errors people make about this whole subject, and both of them are traps. The first error is disbelief. Deciding the whole idea of a real active adversary working against your character is outdated, superstitious, something modern. Rational people have outgrown. That error leaves you defenseless, because you stop watching the door entirely. But the second error, and this is the one almost nobody talks about, is becoming obsessed, seeing sinister plots everywhere, developing what Lewis called an unhealthy interest, turning every inconvenience into a conspiracy, every disagreement into spiritual warfare, every bad mood into demonic attack. Both errors, he warned, delight the same enemy equally. One convinces you there is no danger at all. The other convinces you the danger is everywhere except in the one place it is actually hiding, which is inside your own unexamined habits and self-justifications. So if you came into this video expecting a checklist of scary external threats to watch out for, prepare to be disappointed, and prepare to be far more disturbed than you expected. Because the real target of this warning has always been the mirror. Let's bring this into your world right now, because Lewis was writing in the 1940s, but if he were writing today, watching what you're watching, scrolling what you're scrolling, he would not need to invent new tactics. He would simply point at your phone. Think about how modern technology is engineered. Every app on your home screen was built by teams of extraordinarily intelligent people whose entire job is to keep your attention just a little longer than you intended to give it. Not through anything dramatic. Through tiny, almost invisible nudges, a notification, a slightly addictive scroll mechanism. Content engineered to trigger outrage because outrage keeps you watching. Comparison engineered to make you feel slightly inadequate because inadequacy keeps you scrolling for the fix of the next post that makes you feel better. None of it looks evil. It looks like convenience. It looks like connection. It looks like harmless entertainment. And that is precisely why it works so well. Because Lewis's entire warning was built on one simple, chilling principle. The most effective corruption never looks like corruption while it is happening. It only looks like corruption in hindsight, once the damage is already done. Stay with me. Because here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you if you are being honest with yourself. Ask yourself right now, not later, not after this video ends, but right now, how much of your day is spent in a state Lewis would have recognized instantly as the ideal condition for slow decay. Mildly entertained, mildly distracted, mildly too busy to sit in silence with your own thoughts for more than a few uncomfortable seconds before reaching for a screen to fill the space. He believed that silence, real unfilled silence, was one of the most dangerous things to the scheme of gradual corruption, because silence is where a person actually notices what has been happening to them. Silence is where the erosion becomes visible, which is exactly why, in a world absolutely saturated with noise, entertainment, and endless content competing for every second of your attention. That particular tactic has never been easier to deploy on an entire civilization at once. You are not just an individual being nudged. You are living inside a machine built at scale to keep billions of people from ever sitting still long enough to ask hard questions about who they are becoming. But there is another layer to this, one Lewis returned to again and again, and it might be the most uncomfortable one yet. He believed pride, not obvious cruelty, not violence, not anything dramatic, but simple, ordinary pride, was the primary weapon used against people who consider themselves good. Think about who is actually vulnerable to slow corruption, not the person who already knows they are a mess and is desperately trying to fix themselves. That person is watching for the erosion. The truly vulnerable person is the one who has quietly decided they are already fine, already good enough, already better than most of the people around them. Because that quiet certainty is exactly what stops a person from examining themselves closely enough to notice the slope they are standing on. Lewis argued that self-righteousness disguised as virtue is one of the most efficient tools available, because a person convinced of their own goodness stops checking their own behavior for rot. They assume the rot only happens to other, lesser people. And so it grows, protected by their own confidence that it could never happen to them. Think about how this shows up around you constantly, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. The person who is cruel online but justifies it because their cause is righteous. The person who lies to themselves about their own motives because acknowledging the truth would be uncomfortable. The person who cuts off a friend or family member and constructs an elaborate story in their own head about how they were completely justified, never once examining their own part in it. None of these people think of themselves as the villain of their own story. Almost nobody ever does. That is not an accident. That is, according to Lewis, exactly how it is designed to function. The most effective corruption never asks you to see yourself as bad. It only asks you to keep believing you are good while quietly rearranging your actual behavior underneath that belief, one small rationalization at a time, until the gap between who you think you are and who you have actually become is wide enough to fall into. Now let's talk about isolation, because this is where the warning turns from uncomfortable to genuinely urgent. Lewis believed that community, real, honest, unfiltered relationships where people can see each other clearly and call out what needs calling out, is one of the strongest defenses a person has against slow drift, which means naturally that separating a person from that kind of community is one of the most valuable moves available. And notice how effortlessly that separation happens in the world you actually live in, not through dramatic conflict, through convenience, through busyness, through the slow replacement of deep, difficult, honest relationships with shallow, curated, comfortable ones, where nobody ever has to say anything hard to anybody. You can be surrounded by hundreds of online connections and be more isolated than a person with 3 real friends who actually know you, because none of those hundreds of connections are close enough to notice the erosion happening in you. And even if they noticed, the format does not exactly invite them to say something. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time someone who genuinely knows you sat you down and said something uncomfortable and true because they cared enough to risk the friendship over it? If you cannot remember, that silence itself might be the warning. Here is the turning point of everything we have talked about so far. The moment where all of these threads come together into the single chilling idea behind the title of this video. The enemy is closer than you think, not because something supernatural is lurking in your house. Understand what Lewis was actually pointing at. He was pointing at the space between who you believe yourself to be and who your actual daily choices are quietly making you into. That gap is the closest thing there is. It is not out there in the world. It is not in some other person you can blame. It lives in the 15 minutes you spend scrolling instead of calling someone who needs you. It lives in the small lie you tell because the truth is inconvenient. It lives in the grudge you are nursing and calling justice. It lives in the pride that keeps you from ever seriously asking whether you might be wrong. It has been there the entire time you have been watching this video, sitting quietly in your own unexamined habits, waiting for you to keep scrolling past it, the way you scroll past everything else. If Lewis were making this video himself, standing where you are standing right now, watching the world you actually live in, he would not tell you to be afraid of some external monster. He would tell you the opposite. He would tell you that fear pointed outward is often a way of avoiding fear pointed inward, and inward is where the real work has always needed to happen. He would tell you that the antidote to slow corruption is not paranoia, and it is not denial. It is attention. Real, deliberate, uncomfortable attention paid to your own small daily choices. The ones too boring to notice. The ones you would never think to mention if someone asked how your day went. He would tell you that silence, real silence, unfilled by noise and distraction, is not something to avoid, but something to seek out on purpose. Because it is in that silence that you finally hear what has been happening underneath all the noise. He would tell you that pride is the crack the whole structure gets built on, and humility, the willingness to admit you might be wrong, might be drifting, might already be further down the slope than you realized, is the single most powerful thing standing between you and the version of yourself you are quietly becoming, without permission. So here's what to actually do with everything you just heard, because a warning without a response is just entertainment, and this was never meant to just entertain you. Start noticing the small things, the tiny compromises you make without thinking, the comfortable distractions that fill every uncomfortable silence before you can sit with it, the grudges you have quietly decided are righteous instead of examining whether they are simply convenient, the pride that whispers you are already fine and do not need to look closer. Find people who are close enough and honest enough to tell you the truth when you cannot see it yourself, and actually listen when they do, instead of building a story in your head about why they are wrong. And every so often deliberately put the phone down, sit in the silence you have been avoiding, and ask yourself the one question almost nobody asks anymore. Who am I actually becoming, one small unnoticed choice at a time? Because the frightening truth Lewis left behind, buried inside letters written by a fictional demon almost a century ago, is not really about demons at all. It is about how easily any ordinary, decent, well-meaning person can drift an enormous distance from who they meant to be, simply by never once stopping to check. The enemy was never hiding in the shadows. It was hiding in your routine. And now that you know that, the only real question left is whether you will keep scrolling past it or whether you will finally stop and look. Let's go back for a moment, because there is a piece of the historical context that makes all of this land even harder once you know it. Lewis was not writing these ideas from some quiet, peaceful study far removed from danger. He was writing them in England during the Second World War, while bombs were actually falling on the country around him, while the entire nation was living under the daily, immediate threat of very real, very visible destruction. And yet, in the middle of all that obvious, dramatic danger, what did he choose to warn people about? Not the bombs, not the soldiers. He chose to warn them about comfort, about distraction, about the slow, quiet erosion happening in ordinary living rooms, while everyone's attention was fixed on the loud, obvious threat overhead. Around that same time, he was invited to give a series of radio talks to a nation desperate for something to hold on to, and millions of ordinary people, factory workers, soldiers, mothers waiting for letters from the front, tuned in to listen to a soft-spoken Oxford professor talk about character, temptation, and the condition of the human soul. Think about how strange that is. In the middle of the loudest, most obvious danger a generation had ever faced, people were hungry to hear about the quiet danger instead, because some part of them already suspected that the quiet one was the one actually shaping who they would become on the other side of the war. That should tell you something important about why this warning refuses to go out of date. Every generation assumes its own obvious, dramatic threats are the real danger. War, economic collapse, whatever crisis dominates the headlines this year. And every generation, according to Lewis, is at risk of missing the much quieter threat working underneath all of that noise. The one reshaping individual character while everyone's attention is fixed on the loud thing happening in front of them. Right now, today, in your own life, there is very likely a loud thing occupying most of your attention. A deadline, an argument, a piece of news that has made you angry. And underneath all of that loud, obvious noise, something quieter is very likely happening too. Something you have not had the stillness to notice because the loud thing has been so effectively holding your focus. That is not a coincidence. That is, according to everything we have just walked through, exactly how it is supposed to work. Let's talk about anger for a moment, because this is a re-hook you did not see coming, and it deserves its own honest look. Modern life has made outrage almost a form of entertainment. You can spend an entire evening consuming content specifically designed to make you angry at someone you will never meet, about a situation you have almost no actual power to change, and walk away feeling like you did something, like you cared, like you took a stand, when in reality you simply spent hours of your one, limited, irreplaceable life in a state of agitation that changed nothing except your own nervous system and your own capacity for patience with the people actually in front of you. Lewis warned about exactly this pattern, long before algorithms existed to accelerate it. He noted that a person consumed with anger at a distant, abstract enemy often becomes less patient, less kind, less attentive to the real, close, immediate people who actually depend on them. The energy has to come from somewhere, and if it is being spent raging at strangers on a screen, it is not available for the people sitting across the dinner table. That is not a minor side effect. That is, according to this entire framework, precisely the kind of quiet trade a person makes without ever consciously deciding to make it. Here is another uncomfortable question worth sitting with. Think about the last time you were genuinely deeply wrong about something, and think honestly about how you responded when someone pointed it out. Did you thank them? Did you actually consider it? Or did you feel a small, immediate flash of defensiveness, a need to explain, to justify, to somehow prove that you were not really wrong at all, or that if you were, it was somehow understandable, somehow not your fault? That reflex, according to Lewis, is one of the clearest signs of exactly the kind of pride we talked about earlier. And it is almost universal. Almost nobody is naturally good at hearing they are wrong. But the people who slowly drift the furthest from who they meant to be are usually the ones who never build the muscle to sit with that discomfort long enough to actually hear it. They surround themselves, whether on purpose or simply by convenience, with people and content that agree with them, that confirm what they already believe, that never once ask them the hard question. And the algorithms feeding you content today are, again, extraordinarily good at giving you exactly that. More of what you already agree with, fewer uncomfortable challenges to sit with. A perfectly curated echo chamber that feels like clarity but functions like a blindfold. Now bring this back to the two errors we talked about earlier, because this is where the whole picture finally locks into place. Remember, the first error is deciding none of this is real. That character does not actually erode this way, that you are simply too smart, too self-aware, too good a person for any of it to apply to you. And the second error is becoming so obsessed with the idea that you start seeing sinister plots in every inconvenience, blaming some outside force for problems that are actually the result of your own unexamined choices. The uncomfortable truth sitting exactly between those two errors is this. You are right now in the middle of an ordinary, unremarkable day, being shaped by 1,000 tiny choices you are barely conscious of making. Not by some cartoonish villain, not by pure random chance either. By the accumulated weight of what you pay attention to, what you tolerate in yourself, what you excuse, what you avoid looking at too closely. Lewis's entire warning was never really about convincing you something supernatural was following you around. It was about convincing you to take your own small, boring, daily choices far more seriously than you currently do, because those choices compounded over years are the actual architecture of the person you eventually become. So think about tomorrow morning. Not some distant future version of your life, tomorrow the first hour you're awake. Will it start with silence? Or will it start with a screen? Will the first voice you hear be your own honest thoughts? Or will it be curated outrage and comparison chosen algorithmically to keep you scrolling? That single hour will not destroy you or save you on its own, and that is exactly the point Lewis was making. Nothing this quiet ever works in a single hour. It works in the compound interest of 1,000 hours just like it, repeated without examination, for years. Which means the smallest, most boring decision available to you tomorrow morning might actually matter more than the dramatic ones you are used to thinking of as the real tests of character. The real test was never going to look like a test. That was always the entire warning, hiding in plain sight the whole time. If this made you see your own ordinary day a little differently, that is exactly the point, and it means the warning already did its work. Sit with it. Talk about it with someone who will actually be honest with you. And the next time an entire afternoon slips by in comfortable, mindless distraction, remember what you heard here. Because that quiet, boring, uneventful afternoon might be exactly where the real story is happening.